Gabrielle?
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here to share some thoughts about the evolution of biosciences in Africa over the past several years. I've spent this time working here at the International Livestock Research Institute and been part of a team that's been developing a new initiative called Biosciences Eastern and Central Africa, BecA for short. And this has been a most interesting several years that it's taken to develop this initiative. What I'd like to do today is to share a little bit of the evolution of the BecA concept, to talk about moving forward with BecA as we look now to use the new facilities, and then a little bit about how this fits within the broader international agricultural research agenda. And firstly, thinking about the evolution of BecA, I first became involved in this idea in 2002 when a new Director General, Carlos Serre, came to the International Livestock Research Institute. I happened to be in town in Nairobi at the same time in my capacity as the chair of the Door Foundation, which is a Scottish-based charity. And Carlos found out I was around, so he called me and said, would I come over? He wanted to talk about his laboratories. And he said that these laboratories looked like they needed something of an upgrade. They also needed to have a few more people in them. And he was thinking about, could there be ways to share these more widely with the African scientific community? But he also felt that if he went around advocating this idea, it might seem a little self-serving as the Director General of ILRI. And so he asked if perhaps in my role in the Door Foundation, and because I had a fairly extensive network in the world of biotechnology, perhaps I could raise this idea and perhaps develop the concept more. And so that started off a series of meetings and consultations. One of the most important early meetings was with Dr. Romano Kiyomi, who was the then director of ILRI, the Kenyan Agricultural Research Institute. And I said to Carlos at the time, I think it'd be a good idea to talk with Romano, because if Romano would like this to happen, it can happen. And if he doesn't want it to happen, it's certainly not going to happen. So Romano became very keen on this idea. We formed a small steering committee, and the concept of BecA was developed. Now, at the same time, there were a couple of other facets going on, and BecA has always been a multi-sided initiative with different facets developing, and all of the different components have been essential to make it work. And one of the other things that was happening was the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, was developing around the same time. And they had an idea about developing centres of excellence for science and technology across Africa. So they were very interested in the concept of BecA that was developing here in East Africa, and offered to become partners and to provide what the then Commissioner for Science and Technology called an authorising environment for BecA. And then the third strand was a number of donors became interested, notably CEDA Canada, but also there was early support for this concept development from the Gatsby Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, the Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture, and also the Door Foundation. And those four foundations funded the early concept development. But in terms of the significant capital expenditure, there was a dialogue that had been going on for a number of years with CEDA about the possibility that CEDA Canada, that's the Canadian International Development Agency, could make a capital investment in some new laboratory facilities at ILRI. However, while it was only ILRI, that was a little difficult. But once the dialogue started with the African scientific community, and particularly the partnership with NEPAD, that became a different conversation. And there was quite a famous dinner held in Canada involving Carlos Serre, Bruce Scott, Blake Bromley from Canada, and also the then Canadian Minister for International Development, Susan Whalen. And Minister Whalen became very excited about the idea of a laboratory in Africa and made a commitment through the Canada Fund for Africa that Canada would invest $30 million in both upgrading the facilities here at ILRI to be shared with the African scientific community, and also to develop some networks in conjunction with NEPAD across Africa. And I could go on for several hours about all it took to actually make BecA happen from that time of the Canadian commitment in 2003 until the BecA facilities were officially launched in November 2010 by President Kibaki of Kenya. But I think I'll refrain from doing that and just maybe share a few lessons. I think there were 3 lessons that I certainly learned in that period. And one is that there's a big difference between commitment and check. And indeed, from the time of the commitment of the $30 million from Canada until the really serious money started to flow in terms of constructing new laboratories, took until 2007. And that time, Seganet Kalamu, who's the now director of the BecA Hub, came on board, construction started, money started to flow, and then it took a further 3 years for the laboratories to be finished. But I think then, in terms of understanding that, all those steps along the way were essential. We had to do an environment impact assessment, prepare a business plan, set up the design of the laboratories. And so moving from commitment to check is quite an exercise, and the time and the level of detail that's required should not be underestimated. I think the second lesson that we learned over that time was that partnerships matter, and that partnerships with a number of different organisations in universities and national programs, different donor agencies and politically based organisations require a lot of time and investment in the partnership. But I think one of the key lessons is that in any partnership, it's a good idea to be very clear about who's doing what and who's responsible for delivering what, and then that makes it a clearer relationship all around. The third lesson is that science and politics are quite a difficult mix, an essential mix, but still quite different and difficult. And I think one of the lessons there is it's a good idea for the scientists to be very clear that they're responsible for delivering on the science, and for those in the political arena to realise that they're responsible for managing the politics. And there's a nexus between the two. But they are different skills required for science and in politics, and it's a good idea if you have people with those skills doing the work in the different sectors and having an interesting intersection between. The second area I'd like to talk a little bit about is moving forward with BecA. And we've just now completed a new business plan for BecA for the next 5 years, 2011 to 2015. And that has 3 key areas. One is research, second is capacity strengthening through research, and the third is product incubation. And in terms of the research areas, in the next period, we really need to look at actually doubling the number of people using these new facilities. And that opens some really interesting possibilities by not only having researchers come to BecA on an individual basis, but also looking at the opportunities for BecA to host teams of scientists from across Africa, and indeed their international partners working in some specific areas. So therefore there'd be a number of teams, we believe, concentrating on particular areas. And these areas could be in food and nutrition, they could be in animal health, obviously will be in crop breeding, and perhaps in animal breeding as well. And so I think looking at more concentration of effort and larger teams of people, that will be one way to get a critical mass of people here in the laboratories, and also really to focus on some of these teams that are be hosted by BecA will be delivering important new developments for African agriculture. And part of what they'll be doing will also involve hosting a number of postgraduate students. We have over 60 postgraduate students here at the time coming from different universities in Africa, and also a number of short-term training courses. And these become part of a whole program of capacity strengthening through research. The third area, which BecA will be branching out into, is to place more emphasis on hosting groups who are concerned with product innovation and incubation, and really looking at the research outputs and how these can be taken forward to development outcomes within Africa. And so the new vaccines, the new plant varieties better tests for aflatoxins. That's the real vision, that in 5 years or less, there'll be some real improvements for African farmers coming as a result of the work that's done here at BecA and then through partnerships with universities and national research institutes and the private sector in Africa. The third area I'd like to spend just a few minutes on is some of the work that I'll be now involved in as I'm moving back to Australia after several years in Africa to work with the Crawford Fund. The Crawford Fund is an advocacy group which looks at the role of international agricultural research, at Australia's role in that, and also in trying to work with like-minded other agencies around the world. And the Crawford Fund is starting a new study, which I'll be leading, which we're calling, as a working title, Broadening the Horizons of International Agricultural Research. And what my colleagues at the Crawford Fund, led by Dennis Blight, who's the Executive Director, and others are thinking about is what are some of the emerging trends in international agriculture and how might international agricultural research respond to these new trends. And the trends include the role of the private sector, which is becoming very important in the developing world, and especially in Africa, with very significant private sector investments in the food and agriculture sector. Looking obviously at climate change, it would appear that trying to mitigate climate change is going to be a very long-term exercise, but in the meantime, certainly farmers in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world need to learn how to adapt to climate change, and researchers can help in this way by developing new technologies, new farming practice that help respond to climate change and adapt to climate change. A third area is in the supermarket revolution, which we see here in Africa every Saturday morning. When you go down to the shops, there seems to be a new supermarket appearing. And this has a lot of implications for smallholders and small-scale livestock keepers in being able to access those new markets, and particularly to keep up with the food safety requirements and the delivery chain to be able to produce a surplus and get it into the supermarkets. But the supermarket revolution is an extremely interesting development and one which is gathering pace everywhere in the developing world. And then the other area is in what one might call global public goods, and that's the conservation of genetic resources and how these need to be protected and indeed utilised in the future of food and agriculture. Now, the reason that the Crawford Fund is starting this study is fairly obviously to try and influence future Australian investments in international agricultural research, both by Australian government agencies, but also the Australian private sector, who's becoming more involved in investments in the developing world, in Asia, but increasingly in Africa. And also there's a new Africa-Australia Food Security Initiative that has been started, and that includes a partnership between BecA and CSIRO, which is the preeminent Australian research institute, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. And that makes for some very interesting partnerships between Africa and Australian scientists. The other area is also looking at like-minded other agencies around the world and see if there might be a new agenda emerging in international agricultural research, which indeed the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research is going through a reform process to address some of these new initiatives, but also to think beyond the CGIAR and see if there might be new funding streams for research coming through private sector, supermarket revolution, climate change initiatives, and see how these can actually help develop new technologies for the developing world's farmers. I've described this previously as a first draft of the future. I look forward to returning again and telling you how the first draft went and giving you an update. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much.